unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. It's been a typically busy few months in the world of Indian politics and policy. Today on the show, we're going to discuss the recent terrorist attack which killed 26 civilians in Jammu and Kashmir, one of the deadliest attacks on civilians in the region in years. We're also going to discuss U.S. Vice President JD Vance's recent trip to India, where he and his family just completed a whirlwind trip. And last but not least, we will talk about Trump's tariff threats and how India is responding. To round up all of the latest developments, I'm joined today by two Grand Tamasha regulars, Sadanand Dhume of AEI and the Wall Street Journal. Greetings, Sadanand.
Good to be back.
And Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Tanvi, nice to see you again.
It's great to be back on the pod.
So we are going to begin with this really grim and awful news from J&K on April 22nd. As I think most of our listeners will know, terrorists killed 26 civilians in a meadow outside of the town of Pahalgam. The Resistance Front, which is an affiliate of the designated terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba, claimed responsibility for the attack. We're recording this on Monday, April 28th, when we are not totally clear on what form India's response is going to take. Sadanand, let me start with you. In the aftermath of the attacks, you tweeted something that caught my attention. I just want to read out the tweet. You wrote, "For Modi, this is a moment of truth. If he acts decisively, the vast majority of Indians and the vast majority of world leaders will back him. If he fails to act, or if he chooses empty optics over a meaningful response to Pakistani-backed terrorism, his reputation is unlikely to recover." What do you think would qualify as a quote-unquote meaningful response in your view?
So I think it has two elements, right? And one element is clearly some form of retribution or revenge. I think that's just, it may be unpleasant for some people to hear this, but that is simply a political reality and a political necessity for someone like Modi, someone who was elected to be a strong man, elected to keep people safe, elected in contrast, to what he portrayed as the weakness of the previous government, particularly in its response to the Mumbai terrorist attacks of 2008 and so on. So he needs to be seen to be strong, and a certain amount of that strength is going to be reflected in making sure that the terrorist groups and the people behind the terrorist groups that are behind this atrocity suffer. That's one part of it. But the more substantive part of a meaningful response would be the degree to which India is able to deter these kinds of attacks from taking place in the future. And I think that's the much harder part of the puzzle. How do you raise the costs in a way that either get the Pakistani military to stop backing the kind of jihadist groups that it has long backed against India, or ensure that they think twice before greenlighting or permitting such an atrocity to occur, because they recognize that the cost that would be imposed by India would be very high. And I think that's what people in Delhi are grappling with.
So let me just ask you as a follow-up. I mean, what do you make of Modi's initial response thus far? I mean, obviously they've been very active on the diplomatic front. In a election rally he gave in Bihar, he, in the middle of it, kind of abruptly broke into English, which was clearly a sign that he was speaking to a much larger audience with pretty strong words. I mean, do we have any indication of which direction he's headed based on what we've seen thus far?
With the usual caveats, right? We can't say for certain. But I would say that as of this moment, all evidence points towards some kind of substantive military intervention by India. I don't know whether this is going to take the form of raids or airstrikes or a combination. But I think that the scale of this atrocity will require something. The logic of it dictates that it would have to be something that is seen as more significant than either the raids that India conducted after the Ori massacre in 2016 or the airstrike that it conducted in 2019 after the loss of paratroopers in Kashmir, which was followed by, of course, India attacking across the line of control into Pakistan proper, into Balakot. I imagine that the response is going to be calibrated, but I imagine that it is going to be more severe than either of those two.
So, Tanvi, this is a kind of natural segue to something I wanted to ask you. I was talking to some folks in DC last week, and one of the people I was speaking with was making the point that India doesn't have great military options. The Pakistani military has been mobilized; their forces are on full alert. There could be real downside risks to India if they went beyond symbolic strikes on terrorist training camps because of, air defenses and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's the larger threat of escalation, which looms in the background. My question to you is there room for Modi to maneuver here? I mean, realistically and pragmatically?
Look, in this case, and not least because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, as does India, it's not like there are any perfect options or good options. I think, Sadanand's laid out the potential spectrum of military options. And, the at least so far, the suggestion is from Prime Minister Modi's remarks, their previous behavior, that they will act. Now, they've also laid the ground, though, to say we will do it at a time and place of our choosing. And the question is, and you could also ask questions about who will they target? Could it be, something targeting particular bad actors within Pakistan in terms of some of these groups and their leadership? Or is it something to do with the army? And one of the things I will say is, as India weighs this, it's going to be thinking not just about its options, but I think every one of those options, it's going to be thinking about, what that leads to in terms of Pakistan's next steps, how the international community will respond. But it'll also be thinking about the cost and benefits of every one of those options in terms of the military costs and benefit, the economic costs and benefits, the domestic political costs and benefits. And then, if you put it all together kind of more strategically, an India that wants to do the things that Sadanand said, which is, both punitive, but also to the extent that, deterrence is even possible in this case, some hardening of India's own security apparatus. So wanting to achieve that, but also wanting to ensure that it doesn't do that in a manner that hurts India strategically or distracts it from other priorities as well, making sure India's economic growth continues, that it continues to be seen as an attractive place to do, business as it tries to attract some of this China Plus One investment, and as it also tries to deal with its China threat. China, of course, being Pakistan's closest partner, perhaps. So I don't think there are any great options, but I do think, from what we see today, that unless Prime Minister Modi can make an argument that he's, identified and tracked and punished these specific, the kind of perpetrators of this, if they can be detained, etc., unless he can use his political capital to buy some more time and space because of those strategic considerations, I do think he will exercise some or the other option, but that will be done weighing some of the costs that it could potentially entail, or at least making sure that India is not just prepared for the next step, but the next 2 or 3 steps after that.
So, Sadanand, I'm going to ask you a question that I think I know the answer to, but I'm curious if we agree or disagree on whether there will be a domestic political price to pay for the security lapses which might have allowed this brazen attack to take place. I mean, the Congress, if you look at their social media accounts, they have lambasted the Modi government for repeatedly failing to protect Indians from terror attacks, especially, one like this, which was in a regularly touristed area. Do you think any of these charges that are being lodged by the opposition will stick?
So I think the politically salient question in India is not how did you allow this to happen? I think this politically salient question is what did you do about it after it happened? And I think that for Prime Minister Modi, with his political credibility or lack of credibility, is going to depend on how he answers the second question. There is some talk about how this was allowed to happen and so on, but by and large, I think people recognize that it's very hard to prevent a terrorist attack when you have a determined adversary. They're aware of the fact that this took place near thickly forested territory. Uh, if you have an army and an intelligence agency that is geared to backing these kinds of groups that do this, there's some amount of understanding. I'm not saying people are thrilled with it, but they don't expect 100% record. And if you look at the numbers, in fact, violence has declined quite dramatically over the past several years in Kashmir. So that isn't the question that isn't the political thing that any politician, in my view, should worry about. I think Modi specifically needs to worry about the other question, which is that now that this has happened, what are you going to do about it?
Tanvi, I just want to kind of segue now to the second topic, which was JD Vance's visit. But, just a question on the timing. I mean, do you find import in the fact that this attack took place when the American vice president was on Indian soil?
I think it's too soon to tell. I mean, it wasn't just the U.S. vice president who was in India. It was the Indian prime minister was in Saudi Arabia and also a close partner of Pakistan, but at the same time, the one that has been, like the UAE, deepening economic and defense ties with, and even counterterrorism ties with India in recent years. I think people have pointed to the attack when Bill Clinton visited in 2000, when a number of Sikhs were killed. And said that maybe it's to send a message. It could be. It's one can't rule it out. That it's one way to try to say. I'm not sure this would be a good reading, but that it would show somehow that there was kind of insecurity in Kashmir and the lack of normalcy. But if that was the case, I would say that maybe it didn't have the desired impact that might have been, because if anything, you saw the Trump administration come out, and even though unlike 2016 and 2019, they have not named Pakistan or called Pakistan out by name, they did condemn the attack and called it a terrorist attack, and also said that they supported India. They've also not called for restraint, something again U.S. governments have not done since I think even 2016, 2019, that wasn't done. So it's hard to say about the timing. If the idea was to somehow show that send a message to the West, I'm not sure it's had its effect. But you could also say that could be other things. It could be that this was the start, real opening or the increase in tourists going to Kashmir. It could be there was some indications or reports that Prime Minister Modi was supposed to visit a visit that was cancelled. So it could be just opportunistic. There were just a lot more tourists there than there were a few months ago, or some other things. It's just hard to tell at this point. The one other thing I'd say on the kind of the pressure on Prime Minister Modi is, I mean, it's worth some of your listeners probably know this, others don't, that the victims came from over a dozen states. And so this is not, this is the reaction is nationwide, and a mix of anger, but also just people fed up and frustrated about these what India has called this pattern of terrorism from groups based in Pakistan over the years.
Tanvi, just coming to the specifics of the Vance visit, I mean, he spent 4 days in India. He sort of sandwiched these official meetings in between personal stops in Delhi, Agra, Jaipur. There were a lot of questions prior to his touchdown about sort of what the point of this visit was, other than to kind of take the family on a spring break holiday. Tanvi, I'm wondering if, now that this is kind of behind us in the rear view, what's your sense of, the important takeaways, if any, of this maiden Vance visit to India? I had not realized, for instance, it was his first visit to India. I'd kind of naively assumed with Indian in-laws he might have been there before. So, what struck you about this visit?
So, there's been some question about why he went. It was, and was there anything beyond the personal? I think it's interesting that he did combine this with a visit to the Vatican and to Italy, and then went to India. It's possible that part of this was to show that he could be, a statesman, and Italy and India are two places that, they're pretty sure that he would have the red carpet rolled out for him. Maybe he wanted to draw a contrast, if, between kind of, him lecturing and haranguing, European partners other than Italy, that is, and talking about, the Indo-Pacific partners and countries like India, burden sharing in a different fashion, or kind of highlighting India as a new kind of partner that the administration likes. It could also just be that it came at a time that the administration wanted some kind of international wins, and this was one way to do it. I think one of my takeaways though is whatever the reasoning behind it, and of course this was all taking place while India and the U.S. are negotiating a trade agreement, which now the president probably wants done, at least to try to show that he's getting some deals done. That one of the takeaways, and it was interesting because I was in India at the time, is that it did seem to signal to especially American companies, that India was actually on the nice list, not on the naughty list with this administration, and therefore a legit, and a more certain place to consider as a place to do business. So that was one thing I'm not sure I would have understood if had I not been in country at the time, but that seemed to be one of the takeaways I seem to hear from some MNCs who were there, that this showed to them, this seemed to give them some kind of as much as anybody can be certain about anything these days, that a little bit more certainty that India was safe, so to speak.
Well, I just want to add quickly to that, to Tanvi's excellent points. I would add one other dimension, which I would say that there is probably a domestic political dimension, right? This goes back to some of your work, Milan, that I think Vance is very aware that the movement that he represents and Trump represents is, that it is trying to build a new multi-ethnic coalition. And for various reasons, Indian Americans would be not only an important potential part of this coalition, but also the Republicans may feel a kind of natural constituency worth cultivating. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's an element of that in the background too.
Sadanand, let me kind of flip that around to ask you about Indians' views of America. You had a very interesting column in the Wall Street Journal on the visit, and you had the following to say, and I just want to quote one part of your op-ed where you said, for many decades, a visiting U.S. dignitary in India was all but guaranteed to attract legions of angry demonstrators clogging the streets of major cities. The tepidness of the protests against Mr. Vance underscores a quiet but remarkable change. Anti-Americanism, once a staple of street protests in India, has largely lost its bite. This is something that you touch upon in the piece, but I wonder if you might be willing to elaborate. What do you think, or I should say, why do you think anti-Americanism in India is on the decline?
I think a whole lot of things have come together, right? I mean, if you sort of, just see how things have evolved over the last 30 years, one is that India has become much more economically successful than before, and I think that has boosted people's self-confidence. You've had the very dramatic decline of the most overtly anti-American political parties, namely the communists, right? When President Bush visited India, in 2006, was it? I think it was 2006. The communists had more than 60 members of parliament. Now they have fewer than 10. So the communists have really lost a lot of their street power. You have the rise of this large Indian diaspora, and everybody has a cousin or an uncle or someone there. And so in many ways, the things that were sort of driving this, and obviously, this is, during the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union hasn't been around for a long time. Nonetheless, anti-American in public life in India persisted. And I was struck by in this visit how just, these guys were just going through the motions, these old guys with their hammer and sickle flags, and it's kind of, your heart almost went out to them. They were just kind of like, these pathetic figures. So I think things have just, changed culturally, and India is, it's just not as easy to get 100,000 people on the streets with banners shouting anti-American slogans on the streets of a major Indian city.
Tanvi, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sadanand broadly about the kind of level of anti-Americanism, and you've heard Indian External Affairs Minister talk about the street in India being US friendly and therefore creating the space for the Prime Minister to be more forward leaning with the US. Having said that, I just want to kind of caveat that with a couple of things. One, more broadly and generally, is a lot of the narrative, partly because amongst the parts of the Indian strategic community, there's still, especially in older generations, still a skepticism of the U.S. that can fall into anti-Americanism, or you can see a horseshoe effect where that left that Sadanand mentioned is now joined by the right. That can sometimes say, the U.S. is out to stop India's rise. Now, the fact that we might not be in sync with the large portion of the Indian public is true. But the second thing I was going to say, other than there is still this U.S. skepticism within the system, the second thing I would say is, this should not be taken for granted that the street is U.S. friendly. And one thing that could affect it is how the diaspora is treated, but also Indian students and others are treated. I wouldn't underestimate the impact of these deportation flights that took place on military flights, and then shackling people and the stories. Most Indians, you saw the reaction being, if their people should not be going illegally. But it's if this stuff starts happening to more students being detained. More concerns among tourists about coming to the U.S., what their sense of certainty about how they will be treated. I do think, this is something to watch. I even heard from some on the right that this was not what they expected from a Trump administration, that they think actually is quite like-minded. So I would just say that, that's something to watch. And these are things, by the way, that Russia and China and their information sources in India are happily amplifying. Along with saying that, the U.S. is in decline or trying to force India to do things, this aspect of, how students and others are being treated is something to watch.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
Tanvi, I want to just ask you about Vance's Jaipur speech, which had actually a number of sort of interesting, provocative things in there. At one point, he said something referencing kind of prior administrations, and he said, too often in the past, Washington approached Prime Minister Modi, he mentioned him specifically, with an attitude of preachiness or even one of condescension. Prior administration saw India as a source of low-cost labor on the one hand, even as they criticized the prime minister's government, arguably the most popular in the democratic world. I mean, this must have been music to the BJP and the government's ears. What did you make of this critique of past U.S. administrations? Because I have to say, it struck for me a kind of dissonant note, because one of the remarkable things, as you will know better than I, about U.S.-India relations is how bipartisan they've been. There's actually been a kind of natural progression from administration to administration, including when we've had, Obama to Trump and then to Biden and now to Trump. What did you make of that statement?
It didn't surprise me at all. I did not expect Vice President Vance to do anything but criticize the previous administration. It's what he does, and frankly, it is popular in India, this stance of, we're not going to be preachy about your internal affairs. Even some of the steps at the State Department of saying, why are we telling other countries what to do on democracy and human rights? And so, I think that's something, and we've seen it in other speeches, that the administration, unlike its predecessors, is not tend to give credit to the previous administrations and, continuity or mention. You might hear that from Republicans on the Hill, but that part didn't surprise me. I do think, at the same time, so I think that was welcomed in India. I think there are other internal, domestic policies that the administration will care about. For example, India's data localization or attitude towards big tech. It's not the same kind of internal affairs, but they do care about India's internal policies, and not just in the kind of non-tariff barrier space. I think there are a couple of other things, though. One, that, while they might not acknowledge it, if you look at actually some of the initiatives, et cetera, that they're talking about, a lot of those things were our follow-ons from what the previous administrations did. So, they might not acknowledge it in rhetoric, but in action, they're building on initiatives that the Biden administration undertook. And, you heard talk of the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, I2U2, this India, Israel, US, UAE coalition, some of the defense deals, the Strikers, combat vehicles, the Javelin, co-production, that was all begun in the Biden administration. So changing names like ISET to Trust, those kind of things. So, in some senses, that's fine. As long, in practice, if there's broad continuity, I think that's at least healthy, whether or not that's acknowledged. I think the thing though is, yes, there was a lot of flattery in the beginning. The other thing I will point out is, though that just prepared the ground for what came at the end of the speech, which was the list of asks and expectations of India. So I think it was, it was laying the ground for the kind of transactionalism. And, some in India will say, well, at least, they're very direct about what they want, and we're fine with that as long as they don't get into our politics.
Sadanand, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just to very quickly say, I see it a little bit differently from Tanvi, because I was surprised. I actually thought the reference to, contrasting the Trump administration with previous administrations was jarring, it was unseemly. It defied the old adage of politics stopping at the water's edge. I thought it was completely unnecessary, and I was surprised that he did that. But the other thing that I thought was a bit odd about that speech was it was very much it had the character of the kind of speeches he would give to a domestic audience, right? About essentially about globalization having failed the working man in America. And it just seemed so weird to me for him to give that speech in Jaipur, in India, in a country which has really been one of the great, beneficiaries of the very globalization that he's talking about, right? India is manufacturing a bunch of iPhones, and it wants to manufacture more and more. And that's kind of, that's been the big success of, for example, the Prime Minister's Make in India initiative. And it just seemed like a strange country to pick to kind of, put forward this message of economic nationalism that no doubt plays well with elements of his base.
I think, though, that actually brings me to a point which is connected to, some of our previous discussion, which is, I think, sometimes there's a sense of more same-mindedness, or there's a belief that in India and the US that, the other right-wing party is more, or the center-right party is more like-minded than actually is the case. So, I think this is another case, right, where people say, oh, these guys are much more like us. But then when you talk about immigration, when you talk about, Make in India, when you talk about other things, it starts to break down. And another thing that was mentioned, right, there was a little bit of Europe bashing in this speech. And here you have India that is actually deepening ties with Europe. And then the part that, yes, was a little kind of disconnected from the speech is, it was very clear that Vance wanted to make a contrast between Indo-Pacific allies and partners and European allies. And except, if you look at, in practice, other than a few things, you've not seen that kind of, there was the same language about free and open Indo-Pacific and all that thing, but in in actions, other than, you've seen some visits from Asian allies and partners and a quad ministerial, that has really not been seemed to be kind of the driving force in this administration on foreign policy for now. It's been more kind of, the Western Hemisphere, including the border and things like that, and, the wars, Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Gaza, and dealing with that. So that was a little bit of the other thing that was not quite, the words were there. We'll wait to see if the actions follow.
Sadanand, your point about globalization actually is a nice segue to the third topic, which is this whole question of trade and tariffs. That is something Vance touched upon in his Jaipur speech. As our listeners surely know by now, India was slapped with a 27% reciprocal tariff before the president instituted this 90-day pause, as he did with virtually all other U.S. trading partners. Behind the scenes, we've seen negotiators on both sides signaling progress towards some kind of bilateral understanding. At one point in his Jaipur speech, Vance said that critics have attacked my president, President Trump, for starting a trade war in an effort to bring back the jobs of the past, but nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, Sadanand, as the saying goes, if it smells like a trade war, looks like a trade war, quacks like a trade war, then it's probably a trade war. What did you make of Vance's kind of spirited defense of the administration's actions?
Well, I mean, I think the defense that perhaps has more legs than any other would be that if in the end the president does not go through with this, the 90-day pause becomes a longer pause, and we get sort of something that looks a little bit more a bit normal, right? That's the best defense. But I think if you take the tariffs that were announced on April 2nd at face value, and we assume that they are going to kick in on most countries after that 90-day pause is over, not only is this a trade war, but it's utter and complete lunacy, and I think that's how it's widely seen around the world. And I think the best bet really is that there is some kind of realization in the administration that there are going to be domestic political costs to this, and there's going to be some kind of backpedaling. In which case, I think I can totally understand people in the administration, coming back and sort of referring to this as having been some kind of negotiating tactic or whatever. But the facts as they stand on the ground, I mean, certainly do point toward a trade war, and not simply a trade war between the U.S. and China, but something much broader.
Tanvi, there's been a lot of reporting. I think we're probably all reading the same news alerts that India and the U.S. have finalized the terms of reference covering 19 chapters for a proposed bilateral trade agreement. I'm just curious, again, we don't know a lot of what's happening behind the scenes. How optimistic are you, say, that by the end of the year, there will be some kind of genuine trade accord consummated by these two countries?
I don't know if I'd say optimistic, but I think it's realistic perhaps to assume, with the caveat that who knows, what the legislative process might need to be on this side, that there will be some movement for a few reasons. I think both sides seem to want to try to get something done. For the president, it might be important because some of the other, he wants to show that he's got some deal. He said that he's this was all for a reason. Now he might want to eventually back down. He will not want it to be seen as back down. He wants something to show for it. And all said and done, perhaps because India's such, it's not a big trading partner for the U.S. From the U.S. side, that it's actually an easier thing to get done from the U.S. side. And in India, I think he has a willing partner that, for the reasons I think, I'll just point out, might actually be taking a different attitude and might be more serious about getting some sort of deal done than it had in the past. And I think some of that is there is this broader idea that, the U.S. is such an important partner for India that India wants to keep the administration on side. And in the previous administration, it benefited from the Trump first term eventually taking a China prism view of the world. And because China was important, India became crucial. So you saw in India that was cooperating on that front. This time, awareness in India that this is going to be a commerce first, or an administration that takes a commercial prism. And so wanting to actually deliver on that so that India and the US could do things on other fronts, that it would open up the space. But I think there's some economic reasons as well. I think you've seen in some speeches from the Commerce Minister and the External Affairs Minister a sense that this is a moment where India, because of the need of economic growth and job-creating economic growth, and not just the desire to do trade, but also get more investment, that they want to be different than in the past. They want to conclude some of these agreements, whether with the US, the EU, and the UK, if not other countries. Now, these might not be grand old free trade agreements, but some sort of economic agreements which benefit India, but also where India might be willing to make some concessions. There is this combination of understanding that, if India doesn't take advantage of this moment, that it will continue, it'll still keep growing, but it'll be kind of that muddling along growth that will not create the kind of jobs, 8 million a year for the next 20, 30 years, as the chief economic advisor said. That's the kind of thing India needs to do, not just for economic reasons, but for political reasons as well. And, one lesson learned perhaps from the 2024 Indian election was that young Indians don't just want welfare, they want jobs. And that big Indian business has not been creating the kind of jobs or putting in the kind of investment that the government would like to see. So you've seen these speeches where, the ministers have said, we need to complete these agreements. And we would like to trade, but with developed economies, hint, hint, not China. And this idea that, concern about China dumping goods and others, but essentially saying that economic growth underlies kind of both the politics and even what India is able to do strategically. So I do think this could be a different moment. Having said that, I think, to sell any sort of agreement, the Prime Minister will have to expend some political capital. In the past, we've seen him sometimes back down, but I do think this could be a different moment. So I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I think realistically, this is the best moment we've seen. And as I've said elsewhere, there's a political window of opportunity because there's only one state election between now and next year.
Well, very quickly on this, I agree with Tanvi that there's a sort of seriousness in India and a kind of desire to get this done. I guess I'm just sort of naturally skeptical about U.S.-India trade negotiation than any kind of U.S.-India trade deal in general. Let's not forget, for example, the first Trump term, there was this we were constantly on the edge of coming to some kind of deal, and it never really came to fruition in the end. And some of the fact is to do with the fact that these issues are contentious, they're politically contentious on both sides. But then we also have the fact that temperamentally we have a president who seems to think that importing stuff is something is a horrible sign of weakness. And so if you kind of take all of this together, I think that I guess I would just I would say that I'll believe it when I see it.
I totally agree. I do think though it'll be somewhat more kind of economic rather than necessarily trade. I think the other thing we will see, whether or not this comes, is some outright Indian purchases, whether kind of in oil and LNG, some defense in acquisitions, because I do think whether or not this gets done, they'll want to show, particularly to ensure that the Quad Summit in India goes ahead later this year, that there are some wins on the table that the Trump administration can point to.
So I want to sort of end this conversation by asking you both to reflect on the first 100 days of the Trump administration. There's obviously been no shortage of controversies, no shortage of newsworthy moments, no shortage of Truth Social posts. I'm curious how you would describe the first 3 months and change to a sort of layperson who's maybe not paying as much attention as the three of us are. Not specifically with reference to India, but just how this administration is behaving. Are there things that have, stood out for you or surprised you? Sadanand, let me start with you.
I mean, I guess I would say that we're we seem to be in the early stages of some kind of fundamental reorientation, or at least attempted reorientation of U.S. policy on very wide-ranging issues like trade and immigration. And whether or not this Trump revolution ends up achieving its stated goals, that certainly seems up in the air. But I think that in terms of ambition and in terms of the degree to which they're trying to rewrite what has been a consensus, specifically on these two issues, trade and immigration, but also I think on the larger question of the U.S. involvement in the world. I would pick those three. Is profound. So that's how I would summarize it. In terms of surprises, I guess the part that I was most surprised was by the cack-handedness of these tariffs that they came up with on April 2nd. I wasn't at all surprised that they would move towards raising tariffs and trying to negotiate trade deals that boosted U.S. exports and so on. But I guess the amateurishness of this was surprising to me.
I mean, I was struck. We all met in Washington, the three of us, a couple of weeks ago. And, I was trying to compare it to 2017 when we all were there as well, where, in 2017, I mean, obviously we know that Washington is a left of center kind of Democratic bastion. There was a sort of feelings of kind of sorrow and kind of confusion and upset about the state of the country. And, there was some of that this time. But what has struck me is how many people's lives have been directly affected. I mean, for instance, I was speaking with somebody whose son lost their National Science Foundation scholarship to do his PhD studies at university because it had been rescinded. Spoke with friends who worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace who had been kind of summarily fired. My best friend from college works at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and, is still technically employed by them, but only because of a temporary restraining order. And there was just sort of example after example of people, their children, their in-laws, their neighbors, their friends, their partners who had been kind of personally affected, not just by like, oh, I don't like the direction the country is going, but actually in a very kind of material, direct sense, right? And so those reverberations, and maybe it doesn't feel that way when you go outside of the Beltway, but that was something to me that felt really, really visceral. Tanvi, what about you? What do you make of the first couple of months of this administration?
I think the term that comes to mind is shock and awe, right? That you've seen on so many fronts and so quickly, kind of an adoption of that very techie mantra of move fast and break things. That's the PG version of it. And the thing I would say is it seems like it's on, it's a within the Beltway thing, and people might feel, outside a certain amount of, they're just Washington, the DC equivalent of the Khan Market gang suffering. But actually, when you're, more and more, it's becoming evident that this is not just affecting DC, that this reset, this reorientation, and I absolutely agree, I think that is the attempt. And that's why I think this administration is trying to move fast, that this attempt is affecting almost every people in every state. You have the states of Arkansas and West Virginia couldn't be more Trump country. And their ability to handle disasters being affected by changes in how this administration is thinking about FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency. Or these National Institutes of Health grants that don't just go to the Ivy League colleges, but a lot of state schools around the country, including in places like Alabama and others, they get these grants too. Not to mention the number of stories that we keep hearing now on immigration about people being affected around the country, including a number of Trump voters who are saying we didn't quite expect our seasonal workers on our farms to be affected, or on trade. We're going to hear more and more about small businesses potentially going out of business. So I think this might have seemed like, this was a counter-establishment thing, but it's not just affecting the traditional elites, but I think the impact is much broader. I'm only surprised that people are surprised that Trump is doing exactly what he said he was going to do. And I don't know, maybe that's partly wishful thinking. Maybe that was partly thinking this could not happen in America. But, I usually I'm a historian by training, and I look back at what people's backgrounds are and what they've said in the past. And especially when, somebody like President Trump, who has very strongly held beliefs on some things, as do some people around him, when they've actually said some things for the longest time and they truly believe it, and if they think they have space to do it, I don't know why people thought that they wouldn't move to do some of these things.
I mean, this is kind of gets to the I'd love Sadanand's take on this, the kind of journalist's dilemma, right? I mean, there have been a lot of critiques of the media for reporting on Trump in the way that they have, basically by people, typically from the left, saying, you're kind of giving him all of this free airtime, so to speak, to kind of espouse these crazy views. And, he's just trying to distract and so on and so forth. Now, the trouble is, many of the things he said, as you pointed out, Tanvi, he's actually done, right? I mean, it's not as if these were necessarily just bright, shiny objects to distract. They've actually become executive orders. They've become policy codified, by this administration. Now, of course, they're going to face any number of challenges. We've seen that already in the courts. Congress still has a veto, even though it hasn't seemed necessarily eager to exercise it. But Sadanand, I don't know if you, from sitting, where you do at your perch at the Wall Street Journal, as somebody who's been in journalism for a long time, whether you think that kind of critique of the media coverage was in some sense off base.
I was never particularly sympathetic to that particular critique. But to the extent it had any legs at all, I think it may have had legs in, say, 2015 or so, where you could argue that, that Trump benefited from getting a lot of attention that ended up boosting his campaign. But more recently, I mean, this is the person he's been a former president, and he was a leading contender. He was the leading contender to be the Republican nominee. And after that, he was the Republican nominee and had a good chance of becoming president again. So when he says something, you have to report it. And now he's the president of the United States. So he could say something that is, may strike many people as objectively crazy, but it is definitely news. And I don't think that any journalist has the option of doing their job honestly and either ignoring or downplaying the things he says. So if he says that he wants to take over Greenland, or he wants Canada to be the 51st state, or he thinks that, or he refers to Justin Trudeau as governor, that's just the world we live in. And I think that our first responsibility is to report. Our first responsibility is not to kind of modulate and massage our reporting because of what we think, may be adverse outcomes.
My guests on the show this week are Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Guys, between trade and tariffs, these terrorist attacks and their aftermath, and just generally the kind of newsworthiness of this administration, everything going on, I think we probably have to do another one of these relatively quickly. But thank you so much for taking the time. It was great to talk to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.